Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
That's the political year in a nutshell. Rishi Sunak's outgoing speech as Prime Minister and Keir Starmer's incoming. We're thinking about everything that's changed in 2024 and how it sets us up for next year. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock, and we're doing that thing that is very much in vogue for this time of the year, looking back on what was and what might be coming up next. Of course, it writes itself that this was the year that the Labour Party finally returned to power after 14 years in opposition, and the Conservatives suffered a massive election defeat. It's worth bearing in mind as we sort of head into this conversation, Stephen, that this was around the time we could have been ramping up our election coverage for a January 2025 election.
I just watched you shredding a calendar outside. All well-laid plans.
You could have been out in all the sort of seats in the winter with your sort of duffel coat there. I mean, one thing I did think, thinking back about the election coverage this year, sort of not to preempt our sort of guest, is that it's the first election I can think of where I consumed a lot of my news via podcasts, including this one.
The year of the podcast. We're declaring it now. I mean, it was a year that was pretty neatly divided in two, of the pre and post-election moment that, of course, happened on the 4th of July. We spent all year working towards an election, which we thought was going to come much later. Then we had it. We had the rush of new government. And then we've had what's come since. Perhaps a disappointment from Labour. The budget, of course, a big standout moment too at the end of October. Really tough series of decisions being made by the new government. And we're only going to see the effects of some of those next year when the tax changes come into place in April as well. What sort of pressure is that going to put on the Labour government? Other shifts in the political landscape of note as well. The rise of Reform UK making that electoral breakthrough. 5 MPs now, and Nigel Farage even making it into Parliament on his 8th attempt. So plenty to discuss with our UK political editor, Alex Wickham, who joins us. Alex, this is a year that had plenty of surprises. I don't know on a scale of, more to less surprises where it sits. What's been the biggest moment for you?
Regardless of everything that's happened since and all the grumblings that people might have with the new government and Keir Starmer's performance, this is something that people in the Labour Party have literally been waiting, much of their professional lives for, and finally they get the chance to show whether they're any better in office and their ideas and policies and personalities are any better suited to power than the Conservatives were. It is too early to make that judgment. We can see some early indications, certainly, that it isn't as easy as they might have thought it was going to be. That actually the problems structurally that the British state has are hard to resolve, and you can't just come in and go, well, we're the nice cuddly Labour Party and we're much better than those awful Tories, everything's going to be okay now. It turns out things are more complicated than that. And I think how Labour grapples with those huge trade-offs that they're going to have to make and political decisions of things that are just really difficult is basically the story of the last 6 months at least, and probably the next 4 years.
There's an interesting contradiction here, isn't there? Because I was thinking about what your political theme of the year might be. And on one hand, there's this big change, as you just said, but on the other hand, so much is the same economic problems, the same inheritance, the same difficulty in getting government to do what it wants. What would you say we can learn from how Labour have kind of taken to power in the past kind of 5 months? What kind of lessons do we take from that?
Strategically, if you talk to people around Keir Starmer, they sort of say, look, don't panic. We've deliberately done the hard stuff first. We want to get some of this horrible stuff out the way that we were left with by the Tories, that we had to resolve: the prisons overcrowding crisis, the fiscal situation, many other things, and things will get better. They seem to be relatively relaxed about, where the fact that things will turn around, and this is all part of a plan that, the first year or so might be unpopular, but then they'll get round to it. Now, if you speak to some other people at the top of the Labour Party, they would be perhaps a bit more candid and admit that actually perhaps Labour should have done a bit more policy work in opposition. Perhaps Labour should have, yes, criticised the Tories for the things they did wrong, but perhaps had a bit more detailed thinking about what they would do instead, because we haven't seen a huge amount of big ideas from Labour in government about how to fix the NHS, about how to fix crime, justice, migration, etc., etc. And that is going to be a huge challenge for them. And the danger for Keir Starmer is this narrative that's perhaps starting to emerge over the first 6 months that Labour's disappointed or underwhelmed or hasn't provided change, like you say. If that sets in over the next 12 months, that will be really hard for him to turn around. So he does need a bit of a better story to tell next year.
Yeah, and it's hard not to think about how much of a narrative shift there's been since the election. It went from, this is the moment, here comes change, to this. Let's take a listen.
Things are worse than we ever imagined. These riots didn't happen in a vacuum. They exposed the state of our country, revealed a deeply unhealthy society, the cracks in our foundations laid bare.
So that was Keir Starmer there, speaking not long after taking up office as Prime Minister, but setting up that narrative that you're talking about, Alex, of things being quite negative. We'll come back to the riots in a moment, which was another, of course, very important moment this year politically as well. But, I mean, can there be a tone reset now? Is this a clever political strategy to say that everything's terrible so that, by comparison, things can look better in a couple of months?
They'd like us to think that was the plan all along. I think certainly lots of people in Labour would admit that some of the messaging hasn't been quite right, certainly in the run-up to the budget. A lot of the really negative messaging from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, was seen as basically hitting economic confidence. The tricky thing is that it's really hard to turn that around. And when you've had a budget that raised taxes on businesses and a lot of rhetoric from the Chancellor that didn't quite meet the sort of lofty ambitions on growth that Labour were talking about before the election, she's got to go into the new year and convince businesses and just the public that Britain's got an economy that has strength and is growing and booming and all the rest of it. And if she can't do that, then it is going to be really difficult for her to deliver on her core pledge to have higher economic growth in this country. And turning that around is, she could see that she's starting to try to do that. She goes and meets the CBI and she says, I don't want to do any more tax rises and things like that. But it's going to need a lot more.
Can I ask a very nerdy question about what it's like as a journalist to be sort of doing this job this year? In that we have the regular calendar moments. We've had the budget, like you said. You've had the election. We have the kind of normal warp and weft of Westminster. But this year's also been kind of notable because everything is on social media nowadays. There's been questions about how X works. There's also been new political parties, sort of the rise of reform, the return of the Lib Dems, questions over if Westminster's two-party system is still actually a two-party system. How have you gone about covering that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there is this sort of incumbency problem that politicians around the world have had, whether it's Joe Biden or Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz or whoever. In Britain, we've kind of gone the other way. So around the world, you sort of see these kind of centrist liberal governments losing support and then a sort of populist right coming along as an insurgent. Whereas in Britain, we had a centre-right government which was unpopular and gave way to a centre-left government. So we've kind of gone the opposite direction. That doesn't mean that we can't, just be a few years after everybody else. And like you say, with the rise of reform, Nigel Farage, this sort of fragmenting of British politics, there is a real threat to Keir Starmer or any incumbent. And it's not necessarily the fact that it's Keir Starmer. It's just the fact that people are unhappy with how things are going. And I agree with you. I think social media is just an absolutely massive accelerator of people's displeasure. You used to get people give politicians the benefit of the doubt for a few years, and even Boris Johnson was sort of still popular long into the pandemic, despite varying sort of views on the performance of his government over that. And similarly, you could say, looking back, Tony Blair won elections after the Iraq War and so on and so on. People gave politicians the time of day, I think, a little bit more than they do these days. People are perhaps a bit more cynical, a bit quicker to lose their patience. And I think this is a problem for Keir Starmer because, on social media, it tends to be negative. That tends to be the things that do well on social media. And journalists play our part in that because we love a story criticising a politician, and that's the thing that people read, and so on and so on. And it all sort of perpetuates itself. There is a danger for Keir Starmer that the benefit of the doubt runs out. And while he might have expected 5 years of benefit of the doubt, maybe getting himself a second term almost by default with his big majority, there's no guarantee of that anymore.
Well, thinking about some of the figures who are going to be, perhaps a thorn in Keir Starmer's side, we talked a lot about Nigel Farage around the time of the election. How largely would you expect him to be featuring in the political scene next year, given, of course, his ties to Donald Trump?
Well, this is the thing with Nigel Farage. He is a sort of genius at getting himself in the news. I mean, we've seen with the sort of Elon Musk meeting at Mar-a-Lago, this sort of suggestion that Elon Musk could donate to reform somehow. Whether it's true or not that could happen, journalists have to talk about it. And Farage, for 15, 20 years, has been a genius at making sure he can't be ignored. And it's a really real challenge for journalists because we sort of have to write with scepticism. Oh, Nigel Farage is claiming X, Y, Z that may or may not happen, and it could all just be a bit of smoke and mirrors that is all about him getting in the news and creating rows and creating things for him to be in the middle of. But you can't ignore it. And he, no other politicians have struggled for years with how to deal with him. And Labour face this new dynamic now with Farage in Parliament for the first time, with Trump in the White House, with the president's right-hand man, Elon Musk, tweeting every day that Keir Starmer's useless and Britain's a basket case. This is a new world that is basically unprecedented, and I don't think Keir Starmer has a plan to deal with it. Nobody in Labour has managed to convince me that they've got a plan to deal with it. To be fair to them, I don't know what the answer is. It's such a difficult problem. So Farage is definitely a threat to Starmer, and you could see a world where, in the absence of the Tories as a credible opposition, Farage takes over.
So, obviously, Farage is good at making noise and getting press attention, but as you said, the election's not for quite a way away. In the next year, do you think we're more likely to see Starmer humbled by new Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch or by the Labour left? What is likely to be the first kind of crunch point for this administration?
There is another spending review coming in the spring, and Reeves kind of got away with the first one. It was pretty unpopular. Cabinet ministers were very unhappy. They all rebelled and moaned to Keir Starmer and said, we don't like what Rachel Reeves is up to. And basically, because she was a new chancellor, they all had to lump it and go along with the budget and the first spending review. Cabinet ministers are promising to be tougher this time and say if the chancellor tries it again and cuts my budget, I'm not going to put up with it this time. It's a huge problem because if the fiscal situation isn't any better, we'll see what the ABR says in the spring. It is ultimately going to be spending cuts that are what pay for the government's programme, because she has said she doesn't want to put taxes up in the spring. So that is going to create a massive row in the government that could be existential for particularly Reeves as Chancellor. She's not popular in the cabinet. Chancellors are never popular in the cabinet because Chancellor's job is to say no to ministers' spending proposals. So, it's not a particularly radical thing that the Chancellor isn't popular, but nonetheless, she's got a really difficult challenge to keep Cabinet on side, keep the Labour Party unified. So I would say that is the main immediate threat to Labour in the new year.
Where are the Tories in all of this? I mean, obviously they were in power for half of this year, plus the many years before that as well. They've had their leadership contest now. Should we expect them to be a more visible political force in 2025?
It's really difficult for the Tories because they are so unpopular that, the election result delivering Labour a huge majority, probably most of that result was a vote against the Tories, people fed up with successive Conservative governments and just wanting a different government and wanting to give Labour a chance rather than any big clamouring for Keir Starmer's wonderful vision for Britain. And the problem for Kemi Badenoch and indeed, all these other Conservative shadow cabinet ministers who appear on TV and radio every day is they're criticising the Labour government for things that the Conservatives got wrong. So, for example, on China, which is in the news at the moment, the shadow cabinet is criticising China for not taking, criticising Labour for not taking a tougher stance on China. Well, the Tories didn't do that when they were in office. So, why should we listen to those criticisms? Similarly, on prisons, the Tories can criticise Labour for releasing prisoners because prisons are overcrowded. Well, why are prisons overcrowded? Because the Tories let them get to that position. So the Tories have this just problem that is not going to go away for the next 5 years, which is that anybody who's associated with previous few governments is tainted. And obviously, Kemi Badenoch was in those governments. Most, if not all, of the shadow cabinet were in those governments at some point. How on earth do they win back the trust? Those people win back the trust of the public. It is probably an impossible task, and that's why Farage is doing well, because Badenoch and the shadow cabinet aren't credible at the moment. Maybe that changes in 4 years. People have forgotten about the last Tory government. I'd be surprised. I think people's memories are long, and people are quite unforgiving these days.
Now, we've let you get away with this so far into this podcast, but another person got a very big job this year. Alex Wickham became Bloomberg's political editor. So as the person who's, the leading face of our UK politics coverage, what do you think Bloomberg's UK politics team got well this year? What was the story we were really ahead on? And I'll ask you the awful version of that as well. What do you think something we really missed that next year actually might sort of come rear its head?
I think we were pretty quick on Sunak being a lost cause, basically. We did time and time again stories about internal Tory concerns about Rishi Sunak's premiership and his leadership and his ability to, his political strategy, his ability to win an election or not lose an election badly. And I remember having many conversations with Rishi Sunak's team where they obviously very strongly disagreed with some of that coverage, but it was borne out. And, essentially Sunak led the Tories to their worst election defeat in history. And that was what our coverage was saying for a long, long time. I think we did a decent job on that. I mean, one thing I think we could have done better, not just ourselves, but in the wider media, is scrutinise Labour when they were in opposition. But by the end of the Tories, it just became a foregone conclusion that Labour were going to win the election, and the Tories had their chance and failed, and now it was Labour's go. Perhaps in hindsight, some further scrutiny of Labour's policy proposals, and actually Rishi Sunak would tell you this. He would say, well, I said in the election campaign Labour were going to put taxes up when they promised that they weren't going to. Look what happened. And similar on other policy areas, that could have perhaps have done with a little bit more scrutiny. I remember conversations that I had with very senior people in the Labour Party weeks before the general election where they swore blind that taxes wouldn't go up, and then they did. Interrogating some of those shifts in Labour position might have been something that I would look back on as something I perhaps personally could have done a bit more of.
Well, perhaps you'll get more opportunities in the year to come. Alex Wickham, our UK political editor, thank you very much for joining us. That is it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.